Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our READI Special Populations Roundtable talk. Today, we'll be focusing on learning about autism. This is one of the sections within our disability track that we're very excited to learn more about all that Milestones Autism Resources has to offer, best practices, tips, strategies, and maybe even some opportunities for partnership. We are fortunate to have Bradley, the Director of Education from Milestones Autism Resources, with us today. And the floor is yours.
Oh my gosh, thanks. Hi, everybody. It is nice to see you virtually on these various computers. If you're familiar with Milestones, you might be thinking, hey, who's that guy? Because I'm new to Milestones. I just wait, is it the 31st? This is my 3-month anniversary since joining the organization full time. It's okay if you didn't get me anything. I didn't get you anything either. So I have been with Milestones as the Director of Education for 3 months. Prior to this, I was associated with the organization as a consultant and also working on the conference in the past. But even if you're not familiar with Milestones, that's okay. I'm going to tell you about Milestones, but mostly we're going to talk about autism and how, from the perspective of potential research, what are some key things to be paying attention to. So Milestone's a nonprofit based in Cleveland. We're about 21 years old. The origin story is kind of fun. Mia and Alana, our two founders, both have kids who around the year 2000, they kept running into each other in the waiting rooms of doctor's appointments for various therapies for their kids, and had struck up a conversation and were saying like, gosh, there's lots of stuff out there for autism, but it sure seems to be harder than it should be to access it. And those conversations turned into Milestones. Originally, they put on a conference and started doing some training for schools, eventually added this help desk service that I'll tell you about. And Milestones ultimately is about improving the lives of autistic people by educating, coaching, and connecting the community with trusted information. And a big part of that is we at Milestones are not a direct service provider ourselves. There are other agencies that are providing therapies and supports to autistic people and their families. What we're doing is connecting people who need it with those services, and also using training and other things to raise the overall progress of the field in order to kind of see where trends are, where gaps in service can be, and then what can we do to help connect people to each other to meet those gaps. Since we're a research group, one thing I want to point out with this mission statement is right there where it says trusted information. Up until last year, that used to say evidence-based information. Now, this is not to say that we are no longer interested in evidence. We are intensely interested in evidence. First thing it's important to know is, in the world of autism, there are many people who've had success with a specific therapy or intervention for a specific person, got very excited about how that could help other people, and have sold them as potential treatments, cures even, without a research base behind it. One of the things that Milestones set out to do from the beginning was to steer people towards the things that have a reliable evidence base, rather than situations where, say, someone's promising things that sound too good to be true if only you buy their book or take the pills that aren't approved by the FDA that they're producing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So Milestones kind of set out this flag to be a place to point people to evidence-based stuff. The reason we're using the word trusted now is the field is evolving so fast, and maybe you're finding this in your own research. The definition of evidence-based means different things to different people. For example, when we are working on our conference, as a volunteer, I used to be someone who would review proposals for CEUs to make sure they met criteria. And I would see that different people from different fields had different definitions of evidence-based. Things such as trauma-informed care, holistic supports, other things that are essential to the field, but relatively new, might not meet the same criteria of evidence-based as other things that are using norm-referenced assessments, et cetera. And then there is a socioeconomic intersectional element of that as well. And even though we remain intensely interested in the evidence behind anything that we're sharing, the way we're wording it, it is that we are vetting the resources to make sure that they're coming from trusted sources, as kind of a way that we're wading into the modern socioeconomic research intersection. One thing you should know is that Milestones, I call it the core service, is this help desk service. It's entirely free. Families, individuals, schools even can reach out and say, here is something that we are struggling with around autism, usually for a specific person. And within a few days, someone from our help desk staff will connect them with the information they need. So a very common thing that will happen is a family has a little kid that gets a new autism diagnosis, which is a long process. Not unusual for that family to get 20 pages of recommendations from the doctor. They might reach out to the help desk and say, I don't know where to start, and we will help them figure out where to start. Or I'm having trouble finding a speech therapist that takes our sort of insurance in our sort of neighborhood. Those are the sorts of things that we track information on. We also use these help desk calls as a way to direct us where need is. And then there's this whole other layer of where are the people who are so separated from the necessary resources they don't even know to call the help desk. That becomes another drive. But anyways, that's our core service, and it's easily accessible right from our website. Quick about me, by the way, I am not a clinician. I am not a researcher. I am a certified dual diagnosis specialist from NAD, which is the National Association of Dual Diagnosis. That means I'm a non-clinical professional working at the intersection of mental health and developmental disability. NAD's been around for about 40 years. We in Cleveland, hey, including us at CASE, have a connection. There is a psychiatrist named Dr. Stephen Rudrick, who is sort of NAD royalty. He's been on the board. He was around when it was founded. The whole field of dual diagnosis, the idea that someone with an intellectual or developmental disability can also have other mental health conditions such as depression, anxiety, et cetera, is relatively new. That idea dates back to the early 80s. And that's what NAD is, a national and international now association for the best practices in that field. So that's what my own background is. I will often work as a liaison between clinicians and non-clinical people, like helping psychiatrists and families communicate with each other in a language that makes sense. And so I'm in my own practice integrating knowledge from multiple disciplines. So some autism headlines. Those of you that are familiar with diagnosis in the psychology, psychiatry, et cetera world, the DSM definition of autism changed when the DSM-5 came out. In the past, you had distinct diagnoses such as Asperger's syndrome, PDD-NOS, a pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified, Rett syndrome, childhood disintegrative disorder. All of these different diagnoses, which we've come to better understand as different elements of the spectrum of autism in the DSM, were updated to the modern definition of autism spectrum disorder. And we're gonna take a look at the diagnostic criteria momentarily. I want to approach it a little more organically first. So autism, we know, is inherently neurological, and we know that it is inherently developmental. The current stats coming from the CDC is 1 in 36 children, early childhood age group in the United States, are being identified as autistic. There are fascinating trends with what happens with that. I actually got an email saying that an adult diagnosis statistic was just updated, but I haven't gotten to that email yet. That number was 1 in 40 something a year or two ago. So that number keeps changing, and it's changing fast. And there's all kinds of reasons. A lot of it has to do with improved diagnosis abilities. better recognizing what autism looks like in women and girls of all races, as well as boys and men of color. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. And also the fact that all of those diagnoses moved under a single umbrella, of course, increased the numbers. What do we think makes autism autism? Here's where it gets really interesting from a research perspective. And again, this is me. Remember, I'm not a clinician. I'm sort of summarizing in everyday language. The consensus seems to be that the autistic brain has more synapses than the neurotypical brain because the pruning of neurons and synapses is not as efficient or as busy. So the hypothesis is that, the pruning process, as neurons aren't used, they sort of are pruned away. The theory here is that autistic brains hold on to those neurons more, so there are more pathways that things can go into in the brain, and that is what creates the results that we see as what autism looks like. The casual definition of autism, and I'm borrowing this from the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, a developmental disability that affects how we, I'm talking about myself, Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, experience the world around us. Autism is a normal part of life and makes us who we are. There is no one way to be autistic. Some people can speak. Some autistic people communicate in other ways. Some autistic people do also have intellectual disabilities. Some don't. Some autistic people need a lot of help in their day-to-day lives. Some autistic people only need a little help. Pause from the definitional side, that gets really interesting. For our help desk cause, there are a lot of people who are autistic and are not eligible for any formal developmental disability services because it's, according to where that cutoff line is, does it impact a certain number of domains of day-to-day life, even though they meet the criteria for the diagnosis, it's not impacting the domains of life enough that they're eligible for services. There's an interesting little gap there that we at our help desk are often working to connect people with. Continuing from the ASAN definition, sort of paraphrasing their words, autistic people might think differently, particularly with an interest in patterns and details and routines, might process senses differently. Sensory integration is a huge thing. Also likely to see that people are communicating differently, whether that is spoken language only comes out using scripted words or social communication challenges, especially with socializing and the quote unwritten social rules of life. All sorts of interesting things there. The most important word on that slide is the word might, because the autism spectrum is such a diverse place that those things can't all be true for everyone that's autistic. Even though those are the big trends, there are all sorts of things. Autistic people, little side note, tend to be, vast majority are visual learners and visual thinkers. There are a lot of people have talked about pictures being their primary language, and when they're talking to someone, their brain is translating pictures to spoken words and back and forth. But talking about the diversity of the autism spectrum, one time I worked with someone who was not a visual learner. He was more of an auditory learner, and he was autistic, and that was fascinating. But that's another story for another time. Okay, the DSM criteria. I kind of wanted to talk from a build it from the bottom up, from the human standpoint before getting into the technical criteria right now. So the current DSM criteria, two big categories. One, social communication, and two, restrictive repetitive behavior, interests, activities. Now, the social communication idea, was if you're interested in diagnosing, specifically has to check all three of those boxes: social emotional reciprocity, difficulty with nonverbal communication, and maintaining relationships with others. So anyone who is carrying an autism diagnosis, those three things have been found to be true for them. Restrictive repetitive behavior, we're looking for at least 2 out of the 4 of repetitive speech or motor movements or use of objects or phrases, or their adherence to routine, resistance to change, intense distress at change of routine, or restricted interest with intensity of focus, or the sensory elements, increased and or decreased reactivity to sensory input, and the sensory integration. So 2 of those 4 things are the current criteria. But again, the big headlines are if someone is called autistic, that means that there is that social communication element and also some sort of patterns, restrictive, repetitive behavior, interests, activities element. The spectrum idea is a really interesting one. There are a couple different ways people use the term autism spectrum. One thing we want to point out first, that top stripe, it is not to say it is a spectrum from slightly autistic or even more autistic. That's not really a thing. There are some internal debates about how we can use language to describe how autism affects people, but there's a general consensus that it's not a matter of more or less autistic. It's about endless variation. There are as many different versions of autism as there are colors in the color spectrum. Another really cool way of looking at it, the bottom half of this slide, is if you look at how autism impacts each person, from their sensory integration, their language, their motor skills, all those different things, it creates different shapes of how the autism spectrum affects them. So again, all these different domains are impacting people differently. And yet, of course, the diversity element is absolutely essential. There's this saying from Dr. Stephen Shore, if you've met one person with autism, you have met one person with autism, because there is so much diversity and difference amongst people. Now, something you might have noticed is that sometimes I will talk about autistic people, sometimes I will talk about people who are autistic or the autism spectrum. We are at a pivot point with language right now as a society. The developmental disabilities field in America, in general, tends to use person first language, where we would say something like person with autism. In the autistic world specifically, there are a lot of autistic people who have said, hey, that feels weird when you're saying person with autism, and that's what that picture is trying to capture. It's not like autism is a thing that I carry with me. It's how my brain is wired. It's part of who I am. You can't conceive me by separating this thing from me, and by trying to do that with words, by trying to separate the autism away from me with words, feels unusual, feels uncomfortable. So the autism community tends to prefer identity first language. Someone would refer to themselves as an autistic person rather than trying to make it an accessory. Milestones specifically uses identity first language. The Ohio Department of Developmental Disabilities prefers person first language. So we're in a pivot space in the culture where there isn't one official right answer that you're guaranteed will not be off-putting or offensive to someone. So when we're in those situations, you do your best. And if someone says, hey, don't call me that, just like when anyone says, hey, don't call me anything, be polite. Got to follow that person's preference. Okay. Let's talk about some of this intersectional stuff. Here's where it gets really, really interesting. The foundational research for the diagnosis of autism was done using population of young white males. And the implicit biases of those researchers and are of course baked into that foundation, and then the lack of diversity of their original subjects kind of got encoded into what gets passed on from generation to generation. So due to both that and of course the implicit biases that all humans are recovering from, we're seeing that white children are, even though the general agreement is across racial and ethnic groups, there is no difference in occurrence of autism. The diagnosis and identification of autism is, however, 10% more likely in white children compared to Black children, 20% more likely among white children compared to Hispanic children, and amongst Black children, 10% more likely than compared to Hispanic children. There's a few different things going on here that I want to point out. One is implicit bias, as we had talked about. One of the ways that will express itself is like this. Say a lot of autistic kids, or the identification starts in preschool, where a teacher might see a pattern and say, I wonder if that's autism. That pattern could be someone who gets really frustrated with transitions, doesn't want to play with the other kids the way the teachers are expecting them to. And due to implicit bias at all level, when that same behavior is coming from a child of color, a Black or Hispanic child, we as a educational system are more likely to, instead of say, I wonder if that's autism, say things like, I wonder if that kid is misbehaving, or I wonder if that kid has attention deficit disorder. And those same kids, rather than being identified with autism, might get an identification of oppositional defiant disorder or something like that. Now, there's a similar pattern amongst girls of all races and ethnicities, where girls are more likely to carry labels like anxiety or depression when what's happening is autism, and not discover the autism until later. Let me see if I can say that in a little clearer way. Societally, the way we socialize girls, when we see a girl that is playing by herself with her own toys in the corner, we might say, oh, good for her for being a polite little girl and not bothering other people. Where that same behavior coming out of a mask kid, we might say, oh, that little boy is, I wonder if he's autistic because he's not socializing the way we expect. Where the same behavior with the girl, we might say, oh, good for her for not bothering people. And again, we're talking about implicit bias and the way it shows up. So there are a lot of, and this is a very recent thing, there are a lot of women who are discovering as adults that they're autistic. They had been the whole time. And when they were very young, they learned how to mask the things that they did that made other people uncomfortable, like the ways they would self-stimulate, or their favorite ways of playing or approaching things. People felt were uncomfortable around those things, but were really comfortable when they did the eye contact thing or nodded and smiled. That was reinforced, and that's what they started doing. The community calls that masking. I know I have a handful of friends and colleagues who are women who started to recognize maybe this is autism in their 30s or late 20s, and it's really led to some interesting self-discovery. The question of, does getting that formal diagnosis matter, is a complex one. It can open the door to things like workplace accommodations. Here's the thing, and again, intersectionality. The assessments for a formal autism diagnosis are usually done in three sessions by 3 different clinicians. And that's a lot. Scheduling that is a lot. Right now, for kids who are at prime age for assessment for that in Cleveland, which has tons of autism resources, the wait list for that assessment is 9 months. This is in early childhood, where 9 months of delayed intervention is a really big deal. We at Milestones have a bunch of different grant projects to try to bridge that gap. We're working on one with Metro right now to try to help connect people to services while they're waiting for that formal assessment. And that's for the age where getting the assessment is easy. Once a kid gets older, 8, 10, there are lots of medical systems that don't have people that do those assessments. Once you're talking about an adult, getting that formal autism diagnosis in an adult is very, very complicated. So there's a whole sociocultural element of that too. And we're finding autistic adults finding each other through social networking online, making communities over those things. Oh, I got to tell you more about that in a second. But before I tell you about that in social networks in a second, I do want to point out that there are lots of co-occurring conditions that are common in autism. Anxiety disorder, obsessive compulsive issues, OCD, sleep, eating issues. And then, of course, there are the syndromes such as Fragile X, Ehlers-Danlos, even Down syndrome, which highly increases the likelihood that someone will also have a autism diagnosis. There's significant GI issues that go along with autism. The little t trauma considerations are huge. If you're not familiar with the concept of little t trauma, the idea here is that the capital T traumas are events that as soon as you hear about it, you understand, oh, I could see how that impacts someone, like hearing that someone experienced abuse or is a survivor of an assault or as a child unexpectedly lost a parent at a young age. Little t traumas are smaller events that when repeated can add up to a traumatic effect. That's how the post-traumatic impact of racism and discrimination from a medical standpoint can best be understood as a little t trauma. The idea that those constant exposure to stressors over time add up to a traumatic impact. There are many things about living with an autistic brain in a world that was not designed for autistic brains that can add up to that little t trauma effect. For me personally, that's one of my own passions. Oh, microaggressions, totally. I saw the comment there. Yes, the idea of microaggressions adding up, and what we're talking about here, activating the fight or flight, the stress response. Your body experiences the social stressor. Social stressors are a very big deal to us as humans. And even if it's small, that activates that. What chemicals are we talking about? Cortisone, I believe, allows your large muscles to access the blood flow easier in order to participate in that physical safety, fight or flight, etc. When through microaggressions or through lack of ability to communicate or for constantly invalidating environments, that stress response is activated over and over and over again. The cortisone levels keep staying high, and the physical effects of those traumatic experiences from these, quote, little t traumas look very similar, just about identical, to the physical effects on body health and brain development as surviving the capital T traumas, the ones that we're more likely to recognize as a traditional post-traumatic stress. The intersection of little t trauma and autism is one of my personal most interested things. Speaking of which, since we're talking researchy, something I want to point out is that the autism field is an inherently transdisciplinary one. There are you can't, not true. Start that sentence over, Bradley. It is a very recent thing that you can go somewhere and major in autism studies. Often in the newer places, it is a subshoot of a psychology or education degree. Often collegiate programs that are training people to be professionals working with autism are coming from a very specific behavioral perspective, the applied behavioral analysis perspective as a field. However, there are many fields that we are constantly interacting with, both in the research that is driving our work and also in the referrals that we're making and the professionals that autistic people are seeing. So huge components of education, intervention, special education, psychology, psychiatry, counseling, all of the medical fields, including a subspecialty, developmental medicine, developmental pediatrics even. There's a lot of occupational therapy work in the autism field because of the sensory integration issues, as well as fascinating stuff in speech language pathology, applied behavior analysis, and trauma-informed practice, which I mention, not that there is a major in trauma-informed practice, but I know that is impacting a lot of research. My familiarity as far as case goes is Dr. Bobby Beal at the Center for, oh, I'm blanking on it. Not emerging, Center for Evidence-Based, Center for something exciting practices. Dr. Bobby Beal does trauma-informed care work and consults out of case. Okay. The last thing that I want to share with, there's two more things I want to share with y'all. First one's not going to be this. First one's about our social networks. Because one of the questions coming into this was, are there research things that we at Milestones are participating in now? And there is one with some researchers at John Carroll that we're talking about, which is an interesting little thing. During we got a grant going into 2020 to do some leadership and social networking and like peer support development for autistic people. 2020 came, pandemic's happening, and that pivoted to a virtual space. They ended up using, this was before I was at Milestone, they ended up using the platform Discord, which most people know as a gamers social network platform. And this by autistic for autistic people social group operated by Milestones grew out of that on Discord. And it has 100+ members and not a neurotypical person among them. And apparently that's really interesting. That's really rare. It's the largest of its kind, or one of the largest of its kind. So there are some researchers at John Carroll who are looking at some hypotheses about how do autistic people socially network. And we are working on potentially some stuff with them. Is there data that can be analyzed in order to explore how autistic brains, when it's a by autistic for autistic social network happens. Center for Innovative Practice, that's the one I was looking for. Thank you so much. I knew it was like, it's one of those words I like, innovative. Bobby Beal is someone who I originally met at the trauma-informed care conferences, and it's just very exciting to see her name pop up in the trauma world, not just in Cleveland, but all throughout the state. So the social network thing is a unique thing that we have going on, and how that becomes sustainable going into the future is a really interesting question. The final research-oriented thing I want to lay on you before we totally open up to questions is this article on this slide I'm mentioning here. The title is Autism Research at the Crossroads. The author is Brady Huget, however that's pronounced. It's at spectrumnews.org. A colleague at Milestones just passed this article on to me this week, and I'm like, oh, that's what I've been looking for. There is a sort of a culture war, a power struggle, a internal debate, fight, argument happening in the autism world, where professionals, therapists, people who've spent their lives putting on autism conferences, kind of like me, helping autistic people, are hearing from autistic adults, hey, the way you've been talking about some of that stuff doesn't sound true to me. And all of the person-centered social justice intersectional questions that come up in the modern world are coming up. Like, is it appropriate to have this sort of research if you don't have autistic people participating in it? Are you suggesting things that are inherently traumatizing, that have too much power over? And it becomes hard for the argument then becomes that autistic people are saying, hey, I'm actually autistic, you're not speaking for me, and what you're saying is really problematic. And then there are this happens in social media spaces, where the things that happen when people become angry in social media spaces happen, and all backlashes, all sorts of stuff. The reading, if you're interested in this sort of research and the different forces behind it, got to read this article. If you want to understand what the sort of internal social things we're working through in the autism community are right now, read that article. The numbers I want to point out to you are how the research funding works. There is lots of research money going into understanding what creates autism, understanding the quote causes of autism. And of course, the best hypotheses being a interplay between environmental and genetic factors. But that gets the vast majority of research money. And then the early childhood sector gets lots more because of the clear indication that early intervention leads to more positive outcomes. The rest of quality of life for autistic people is only getting 9% or so of the research. 6% of the research funding goes into things about the services that we as a society provide for autistic people in order to lift up quality of life. And what this meta-analysis was calling autistic supports across the lifespan is only receiving 3% of the research money. So autistic people are going into the world of research funding and saying, hey, all of this money you're throwing into autism, we're here, we exist, and very little of that money is actually helping us. It seems to be trying to understand how we got here, and like, that's kind of weird, to use my own language. So this article summarizes all of that so delightfully that I wanted to share it. And those are the thoughts that I have begun. Richard Cole, I think I recognize your name from the Center for Innovative Practices, maybe from some of the trauma-informed care fidelity scales, perhaps. Maybe we met in the regional the regional collaboratives. But anyways, hi, just seeing your name. So open to questions. If you want to unmute, if we want to facilitate, I am up for anything here.
First, just would like to thank you for that information-packed presentation. I'm sitting over here trying to keep up, taking notes. My first question, though, and I think you really introduced it very nicely with your final commentary about what does it really look like to essentially create or co-design spaces where people with autism can thrive. So when we think about it in our context, in a scientific lab, in public health, doing health equity work, we need to be doing those things with everyone. So when we just co-created this LGBTQ plus inclusivity for researchers workshop with the LGBT Community Center of Greater Cleveland, I mean, it sounds like that's something that we need to be doing for, you know, all disabilities, of course, but when we think about autism, since that's the focus of today, what kind of next steps or recommendations would you have about how to make the research landscape more inclusive?
Yeah, asking the kind of like you alluded to, like including people that, you know, the research is going to affect in the process. The nothing about us without us phrase comes from other disability fields, is a way to do it. We at Milestones get very into the universal design concept, especially socially, because the things that tend to make environments more welcoming for autistic people, the ability to expect, understand what's going to happen and receive fair warning of what's coming, to be able to navigate different sensory input, to have clear social expectations, to have a variety of different ways to communicate, to not have unwritten social rules that people are expected to follow. Those are best practices for creating a welcoming environment for autistic people. And those are kind of good universal design best practices for everyone. Something I get really jazzed about is what is universal design for autism and what is universal design for people with significant trauma histories, and how much overlap there is there. Yeah, we're talking about equity. I'm gonna pull up a meme. I didn't put it in the slideshow, but I'm gonna. The equity versus equality versus. One of the things that's fun for me is if I see a really, really good graphic on Facebook or Instagram, I'll save it and use it in a presentation. So like when we're out like at a conference giving CEUs, I'll have to like dig through Pinterest to find where the citation originally came from. It can be challenging, but yeah. So this is I'm gonna pull up, but if you have another question while I'm finding this thing I'm looking for, go for it. Here it is, equity versus share screen. Let's use this one. We just did a sensory-friendly consult at the Cleveland Museum of Art. They're going to be having a monthly sensory-friendly event. That's what this came from. When you said the thing about equity, that made me think of this. So again, cartoons about inclusion from the internet. If you look at that visual conception of what is equality, this visual concept of what is equity, what we're starting to get really, really interested is universal design. The idea that from the beginning, everyone is able to access it on their own terms in a way that doesn't require special accommodations. Yeah, that's a whole thing. And frankly, I know it's one of those things where I know I only know the headlines on it. Universal design comes from like city planning, architecture, feels like that originally. And I have very little knowledge about that. So I know it's possible there's other people who could tell me all sorts of things about it, but I'm familiar with the cartoon conceptual level.
That's brilliant. It makes a lot of sense. I mean, one of the things that we've done for a couple of our in-person events is invite an American Sign Language interpreter from the Center for Speech and Hearing, Cleveland Center for Speech and Hearing. And without having someone request it, we're trying to build for the audience that we seek, which is everyone. So we don't want that to have to be a barrier. So I like that term. I mean, literally that sums it up. When you were talking about the little t trauma, and this is likely new to me because my background is not, I'm not trained in this space, but that was incredibly interesting. And I put the comment in the chat about microaggressions, and just, I guess this is more of a comment than a question, but well, maybe it is a question. What recommendations do you have based on your experiences, either lived or observed, when it comes to trying to describe what microaggressions feel like, how they're committed, how we can be more self-aware about not committing them? And it could be in the context of autism or not. It could be universal.
I am going to speak from more personal perspective than professional, just because talking about I talk about little t trauma a lot. Talking about it specifically from the perspective of microaggression isn't something that I talk about a lot. And here's the other thing, and this is where I'm going. I am an awkward human being. Mind you, most of us are. Part of what all of this work has led me to is just kind of trying to march in my own authentic world. And something that I've picked up from actually trauma conferences in particular is the implicit bias that comes through people. It's baked in. It's early conditioning. When we recognize that it's happening, trying to act according to our values and say, oh yeah, I don't want to have these aggressive or socially violent or separating, off-putting effects on people. I'm going to try to act in a way that does, but there's no such thing as perfect. My own quest as a human is to act with more intention. But the research about implicit biases, if you get really into it, there's research about identifying it. But the question then comes, can you train people out of implicit bias? Ooh. And yeah, that's not really a thing. So a lot of the what do you do with it comes into coming up with equalizing systems. My own, if you were to put into a recommendation, for me, the principles that I call trauma-informed care, trying to realize the impact of trauma, recognize when it's happening, respond by creating policy and choices and action that incorporates that, and resisting accidentally re-traumatizing people in your own work, is what guides my own attempts to not trying to remove microaggressions from my own work. But here's, like, real talk, I am a not autistic person giving a presentation about and how you should include autistic people in your presentations. Like, there is potential things that I'm aware that I'm doing that could be perceived as power imbalance microaggression. And I don't say that with pride at all. I just say that acknowledging the truth that as humans, we're all doing the best that we can. And I'm not interested in, I'm going to start that sentence over. And when we're in a fear stance of I'm afraid I'm going to say the wrong thing, it can prevent you from connecting to your true intentions and accomplishing all the good things you want to accomplish anyways. For me, it always comes back to trauma-informed care. That's the driver for me. Didn't that sort of say what you were asking about?
Yes, it absolutely did. And I have a follow-up question. I don't want to take all the space though, or I don't want to take the majority of space. Do we have any questions in the chat, or if someone would like to come off mute and ask their question? Maybe Bradley, you could expound upon when you had said you don't want to re-traumatize people through your work. I think that's something that we have to be very sensitive to as well, because being in the research, equity, accessibility, diversity, and inclusion space, and we're doing these special populations roundtable talks. And to your point, so I'm a Black woman, heterosexual, she, her, hers pronouns. And, you know, we're talking about people with physical disabilities. I don't have a physical disability. Granted, I wasn't giving the presentation, but I guess what I'm trying to get at here is when you say re-traumatization or re-traumatizing, what are some strategies that you use to avoid doing that, knowing that you're working in a space that for a community that you don't necessarily belong to?
Right. So the intersectional element of that is we all have to remember, or I would encourage us all to remember, that part of intersectionality is that we're carrying identities into a room that we're not necessarily aware of. I am not like particularly into the fact that I'm a male. Like that's not particularly important to sense of my identity. I own the fact that I am a large male presenting person, and that impacts other people when they see that. I've had to learn that walking into a social service space as the white man, there are things that people will perceive and think of that wouldn't necessarily occur to me, but that's part of intersectionality. That's my intersectional identities, even if I'm not aware of them, are coming into the room. Approaching that with humility and self-grace is important. One thing that those of you in the field have probably thought about is like the answer is to be yourself and act with intention and cultural humility and curiosity and really wanting to learn. When we're in the fear space of, oh no, I don't want to say the wrong thing, especially if we do that socially and encourage this idea that if you say the wrong thing, you're going to be in really big trouble, that can create another layer of social stress that prevents all of us from being at our best. And I'm doing a thing where there it is. I'm pulling up another slide. This means, I'm in third month of the job and my slide creation has been going well. So if not resisting re-traumatizing people is a primary goal, and it's a huge one, especially working with people with disabilities where there's so many power differentials. What do we do? The guiding principles of increasing safety. Anytime you can increase or focus on trustworthiness and transparency, peer support, collaboration, mutuality, empowerment, choice, and remembering that we don't live in a vacuum. And so this is sort of what I was talking about. There are cultural, historical, and gender issues at play at all times, and approaching those with humility provides us with sort of the framework to do those things. The model of trauma-informed care that I particularly use and that we're really interested in at Milestones is trauma responsive care by Laura Pele and Kevin Aldridge, which comes down to increasing safety, increasing connection, and increasing control for people. And at the same time, trying to decrease felt unsafety or feeling unsafe, decrease disconnect and isolation, and decrease situations where people are out of control. That to me is the common language way to do things like reducing re-traumatization. So if you're creating a space where you want to be welcoming and inclusive and equitable to people, the values that I would say drive that are anytime you can be aware of an increased felt safety, increase control for people, increase connection, you're doing that. And that particularly is why I like, it's like I own my own mistakes. I own the fact that I can say and do things that will hurt other people, even if it's accidental. And I know that connection is one of the things that will not only provide healing out of those moments, but also make it more likely that I will act closer to intention the next time. And it's not easy, especially if we're in a situation where we're afraid to say the wrong thing, which most of us are. That, you know, it can be tough, but this is it becomes a very mindful practice at the end of the day.
That was excellent. Thank you for showing that slide and explaining.
It gets really interesting, like when we're doing consults for, like, gosh, Rainbow Babies and Children's, one of their medical floors had us in to try to work on increasing safety and reducing like reactive aggressive behaviors in some of the kids they were working with. And so things come interesting. It's like, okay, if we know that increasing someone's sense of control is inherent to helping them stay out of that fight or flight, what if you've got a kid who needs a medical procedure and literally you have to put an IV in them to help them feel safe? What, you know, how do you increase control where you can, even though inherently it can't be everywhere?
All right. Do we have any other questions, comments for Bradley before our time is up?
I want to point out, and please interrupt or type in if you still haven't answered that question. One other thing I want to point out is that research with autistic people can get complicated once you add in people who have co-occurring intellectual disabilities. There's a lot of history of unethical medical research or questionable medical research in the past that led to specific rights to not participate in research, you know, all the things that I'm sure y'all know way more about than I do. But like, it can be a thing in the medical field where getting people who have intellectual disability to be able to participate in drug trials is really, really hard because there's so many checks and balances to make sure that we're not experimenting on people who can't give what others would recognize as informed consent, stuff like that. That can accidentally contribute to health inequities once you see who contributes to the research. So anyways, there's another thing for the researchers out there.
Thank you for that. Well, all right. Thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon and for your attention and engagement. And thank you again, Bradley, for all of your insights. I trust this won't be the last time that we touch base because there's so much depth to everything that you presented, and we'd like to dig deeper and continue understanding and learning more. So have a great afternoon, everyone.
I saw a question from Gina right there about things for services providers for parents of autistic children. And yeah, they're out there, support groups, all sorts of stuff. If you use our help desk function at Milestones, yeah, they'll connect you with the right stuff. And by the way, I want to point out that that is one of the most consistent questions I'm getting at presentations. We as a society are discovering we need to do a lot of care for the caregivers out there. Thanks for having me, everybody. Good times.
Thank you.
Yeah.